you smell that? This is a violation, a health hazard. I'll have this shut down." That was Karen, her face flushed crimson, coughing into her manicured hand, a stack of HOA violation papers clutched like holy scripture. Behind her, my smoker hissed and crackled, releasing a ribbon of mesquite smoke into the soft Sunday air. Neighbors peeked out from behind blinds. Kids froze mid-bike ride. The cul-de-sac had never felt quieter, except for Karen's voice, slicing through it like a siren. Now pause that frame. Hold it. Because what you're seeing is the exact moment my peaceful backyard ritual transformed into a suburban crime scene, at least in Karen's mind. You're about to hear how something as ordinary as smoked brisket became the battlefield for the nastiest HOA war my street had ever seen. Imagine the sound of a knife dragging across a plate. That's how sharp this feud got. And here's the kicker. I didn't start it. I just wanted to feed my family and my friends. But power-hungry people like Karen, they can turn smoke into fire faster than you'd think. So let's rewind. 3 weeks earlier. The neighborhood looked like something out of a real estate brochure. Perfect lawns, coordinated mailboxes, driveways lined with mid-sized SUVs. It was the kind of place where the hum of lawnmowers was the soundtrack of Saturday mornings, and kids' laughter echoed down the cul-de-sac until the porch lights came on. I moved here for that peace, for the stability, for the promise that my Sundays could be spent slow-smoking ribs while the smell of hickory floated across the block. Every Sunday, I'd set my smoker in the corner of the driveway near the flower bed where my wife planted lavender. I'd rub down briskets with my homemade blend of paprika, garlic powder, and a touch of brown sugar. By noon, the smoke would drift lazily down the street, and like clockwork, neighbors would wander over, drawn in like moths to a flame. Some brought beer, others just an empty plate. Nobody complained, not once. That is, until Karen became president of the HOA. You ever meet someone who wields a rule book like it's a weapon? That was her. She didn't just enforce bylaws, she interpreted them, bent them, twisted them until they snapped in her favor. When she was elected president last spring, it wasn't a victory, it was a coronation. She strutted around in her pastel cardigans, clipboard always in hand, as if she had been chosen to safeguard suburban perfection. And let me tell you, she thrived on confrontation. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a letter, a crisp white envelope tucked under my doormat, stamped with the HOA's logo. The wording was polite, almost sweet. "Dear resident, it has come to the attention of the association that your use of an outdoor cooking appliance may be in violation of Section 4.3 of the Covenants. Please discontinue use immediately or risk fines." At first I laughed. Section 4.3? I pulled out my copy of the HOA bylaws. Section 4.3 covered outdoor equipment. Trash cans, basketball hoops, garden gnomes. Yes, gnomes were actually listed. But smokers? Not a word. Karen had circled nuisance appliances. That was her hook. I figured it was a misunderstanding. So I walked over to her house that evening, letter in hand. She opened the door with that frozen smile, the kind that looks polite but doesn't touch the eyes. "Karen," I said, "this must be a mistake. The bylaws don't mention smokers. I've had this for years." Her smile cracked into something sharper. "The interpretation of the rule is at the discretion of the board. Smoke can be a nuisance. You'll need to comply." She said it like she was the final judge and jury. No room for debate. I could feel the anger bubbling in my chest, but I swallowed it. "I'll think about it," I muttered. That was mistake number one, because in Karen's mind, hesitation was weakness, and weakness, that was fuel. The next Sunday, I smoked anyway. a rack of ribs, slow and steady. By mid-afternoon, the smell had drifted neighbors over again, except this time, Karen showed up too. She didn't bring a plate. She brought her phone, snapping pictures like she was collecting evidence for trial. "This is going into the report," she hissed. I shrugged, handed a rib to my neighbor Paul. "You want one, Karen? Might make you less cranky." That line, that was mistake number 2. By Tuesday, I had a second letter. This one wasn't sweet. It was a formal violation notice. $50 fine, payable in 30 days. If not, penalties would escalate. And the kicker? A threat of legal action under covenant enforcement. Now, if you've never dealt with an HOA, let me explain. They don't play around with fines. They stack them. They send them to collections. Some HOAs even put liens on houses. Yes, liens. Over something as small as leaving your trash can out too long, or in my case, firing up a smoker. That's when I realized this wasn't about bylaws. It was about power. Karen saw herself as queen of the cul-de-sac, and my smoker, that was her chance to prove she could bend anyone to her will. But I wasn't just anyone. The escalation came fast. One night around midnight, I spotted her silhouette on my driveway, clipboard in hand, crouched near the smoker like a burglar. When I flipped on the porch light, she froze. Her excuse was checking for fire hazards. Then she scurried off into the dark. Tell me, what kind of person prowls their neighbor's property at midnight with a clipboard? By the end of that week, I had 3 fines, one for nuisance smoke, one for odor disturbance, and get this, one for attracting loiterers, because apparently my neighbors stopping by for food counted as trespassing. That Friday, I stood at my mailbox staring at the stack of violations. My hands shook with a mix of rage and disbelief. Around me, the neighborhood carried on like nothing was wrong, sprinklers hissing, kids chasing each other, the faint hum of garage doors opening. But all I could see was Karen, smiling that smug smile, believing she had already won. She didn't realize it yet, but she had just started something bigger than either of us could control. Because here's the truth. You can take away a man's peace, his money, even his pride. But you try to take away his brisket, that's a fight to the end. And I was ready to play her game. But not the way she expected. That's where I'll leave you, for now. Picture me standing there, HOA violation in one hand, a rib bone in the other, plotting my next move. Karen thought she had written the rules. She didn't realize I was already rewriting the playbook. So tell me, what would you have done if your neighbor tried to ban your smoker? Because the war was only just beginning.
Section 4.3, Outdoor Equipment, Subclause B. Any item producing persistent smoke, odor, or nuisance is strictly prohibited. There it is, right here. Karen's hand came down hard on the rulebook, the thud echoing off the meeting room's beige walls. Her manicured fingers stabbed the page like she was delivering the final nail in a coffin. Around the table, the other board members shifted uncomfortably, their folding chairs squeaking like guilty accomplices. Karen's lips curled into a smirk, as if she had just cracked the Da Vinci Code. And me? I sat there staring at the highlighted words, realizing this wasn't about the smoker anymore. This was about control. Now freeze that moment. Imagine the sound of paper tearing, magnified, sharp enough to make your teeth ache. That's what it felt like. Karen ripping apart common sense, twisting the rulebook into her own weapon. You're probably wondering, could one line, buried in legalese, really decide the fate of my Sunday brisket? The answer is yes. And worse, she was willing to stretch those words until they snapped, just to make an example out of me. So let's rewind. 2 weeks before that meeting, things still felt almost normal. The cul-de-sac had its rhythm, kids chalking hopscotch squares on the sidewalks, sprinklers misting the air, the occasional whine of a leaf blower. Neighbors leaned on fences, beer cans sweating in the heat, trading gossip about fertilizer brands and summer vacation plans. It was suburban bliss, boring, predictable, safe, exactly what HOAs were designed to protect. But here's the dirty little secret about HOAs. Those bylaws, those thick rule books written in stiff lawyer speak, they're not gospel. They're malleable, open to interpretation. And someone like Karen, who fed on technicalities the way a hawk feeds on field mice, could weaponize every vague phrase. The first time I heard about her interpretation was from my neighbor Paul. He strolled over one evening, a beer in hand, shaking his head like a man carrying bad news. "She's talking about you," he muttered. I raised an eyebrow. "What now?" "She's been parading that rule book around, telling anyone who'll listen that your smoker falls under nuisance appliances. Says it's a fire hazard, a health risk, an eyesore, take your pick." I laughed, but it came out hollow. "Burgers are a health risk now?" Paul smirked, but his eyes carried worry. "She's got people nodding along. You know how it works. You repeat something enough, it starts sounding like the truth." He wasn't wrong. That week, I noticed the whispers. Mrs. Henderson pausing at her mailbox, wrinkling her nose a little too dramatically when the smoke drifted. The Miller kids, who usually begged for ribs, suddenly keeping their distance, muttering about rules. Even old Mr. Clark, who'd once called my brisket the best thing since sliced bread, started hedging his compliments. Karen's campaign wasn't subtle. She was laying the groundwork, brick by brick, for my downfall. By the time the violation notice landed in my mailbox, I already knew what it would say. The envelope was thin but heavy, the HOA logo stamped in bold blue ink. Inside, a single-page document with the kind of legal precision that only comes from hours spent hunched over a highlighter. Formal notice of violation, pursuant to Section 4.3, Outdoor Equipment, Subclause B. Resident is hereby notified that the use of an outdoor smoker constitutes a violation of the HOA covenants due to persistent smoke and odor nuisance. A fine of $50 has been assessed. Continued violations may result in escalating fines, legal action, or property lien enforcement. There it was, the first official shot fired. I could almost hear Karen's voice as I read it, dripping with self-righteous satisfaction. She had finally done it, turned smoke into a legal nuisance backed by the authority of the HOA. And here's the thing. She wasn't technically lying. Section 4.3 was vague enough to be twisted. No clear definitions, no objective measurements, just the catch-all phrase, persistent smoke. How do you fight something so subjective? I wasn't about to let her win. That's how I found myself in the fluorescent-lit HOA meeting room 2 weeks later. Beige walls, folding chairs, a long table at the front covered with neatly stacked agendas and bottled water. The air smelled faintly of copier toner and desperation. A handful of residents sat scattered in the audience, some curious, some clearly dragged here against their will. Karen sat at the head of the table, her pastel sweater draped just so, rule book in front of her like a holy text. To her left, the treasurer, a timid man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. To her right, the secretary, scribbling notes with the intensity of a courtroom stenographer. When my agenda item came up, Karen's eyes lit up. She slammed the rule book onto the table, flipping to the highlighted clause with a flourish. "Section 4.3, she declared, her voice sharp and triumphant. "Outdoor equipment producing persistent smoke. Our resident here has been in clear violation." She looked straight at me, smiling like a cat who'd cornered a mouse. I leaned forward, keeping my voice calm, while my pulse hammered in my ears. "That section doesn't even mention smokers. It's vague by design. If you can call my smoker a violation, what's next? Fire pits? Charcoal grills? Candles?" A murmur rippled through the room. A couple of residents nodded. One whispered, "He's got a point." For a split second, I thought maybe reason would win. But Karen wasn't after reason. She was after dominance. She tapped the page with her nail. Click, click, click. Each sound a warning shot. "The language is clear. Persistent smoke is prohibited. Your smoker produces smoke.
End of discussion. I wanted to laugh, but the weight of her words crushed the humor out of me. Because here's the terrifying part. In the world of HOAs, perception is reality. If the board agreed with her interpretation, that became the law. No court, no appeal, no due process, just Karen's word, enshrined in meeting minutes. By the end of the meeting, the board voted. 2 in favor of Karen's interpretation, 1 abstaining. My violation stood. $50, due by the end of the month. Walking out into the night, the air felt heavier. My neighbors avoided eye contact. Karen lingered by the door, whispering to the secretary, her laughter sharp and metallic. She had won the battle, and she wanted me to know it. But here's the thing about battles. They're just chapters in a war. I drove home, the violation slip crumpled in my fist. My smoker sat quiet in the driveway, as if it too felt the weight of defeat. I stared at it under the porch light, the steel barrel gleaming like a soldier waiting for orders. That's when it hit me. Karen wasn't unbeatable. She was predictable. She thrived on twisting rules, but rules could be twisted both ways. The war had just shifted gears. And as I stood there, the smell of last week's hickory still faintly clinging to the air, one thought consumed me. If Karen wanted a witch hunt, I was going to give her the bonfire.
The light snapped on, and there she was. Clipboard, flashlight, a startled freeze before she scuttled into the shadows like something feral, caught rifling through garbage. Only it wasn't garbage. It was my yard, my life, my supposed violations. I'll never forget the way she looked back, her mouth twisted into a guilty half-smile, as though the rules themselves had deputized her to trespass at midnight. You ever see someone pretend they weren't doing exactly what you just caught them doing? That was Karen, my HOA president, my personal warden. Now, let's rewind 3 weeks, because this wasn't her first sneak attack. No, this was the crescendo of a campaign, and it all started with the letters. The first one arrived folded neatly, tucked under my doormat like some kind of ransom note. Notice of violation. That phrase, bolded, underlined, and weaponized. My alleged crime? Improper placement of outdoor furniture. My grill. The same grill I'd cooked burgers on every Sunday for 2 years without so much as a neighborly complaint. But now, according to Karen's interpretation of subsection 14B, it wasn't set back adequately from the shared property line. I remember standing there, letter in hand, the smell of charred meat still drifting from the grate, thinking, this is ridiculous. But here's the kicker. The fine schedule was stapled to the back. First warning, free. Second, $50. Third, $100. After that, legal remedies may be pursued. I wasn't imagining things anymore. This wasn't neighborly oversight. This was a slow bleed designed to make me surrender. By the second week, the letters came in waves. Lawn too long by half an inch. Garbage can visible from the street for extended duration. Decorative lighting, non-compliant with HOA-approved color temperature. Do you know how insane it feels to get cited for the warmth of your light bulbs? That's not oversight. That's obsession. I'd run into her at the block party that Saturday. She stood by the potato salad, plastic wine glass in hand, chatting like she hadn't just mailed me 3 separate threats in the last 10 days. Lovely turnout, isn't it? She chirped. The mask of civility was almost impressive. I nodded, forcing a smile while the pit in my stomach hardened. She thrived on the pretense, sugarcoating her harassment with neighborly banter. Behind her, I caught whispers. Other neighbors had started to notice. She's after him. Poor guy can't even breathe without a violation. And yet nobody stood up to her. That's the power of an HOA president. The title, the bylaws, the illusion of authority. Most folks would rather keep their heads down than risk the crosshairs. Then came the inspections. Officially, the HOA board has the right to conduct periodic property checks, but they're supposed to be scheduled with written notice. Karen had a different definition of scheduled. She called them random audits, a phrase she coined and parroted at every meeting until it sounded legitimate. She'd stroll past my house with a clipboard, scribbling in the margins, as if she was surveying crime scenes. Once, I saw her measuring my driveway with a tape measure, muttering about encroachment. Another time, she crouched by my mailbox, eyeing the paint as though it held national secrets. "Karen," I called out from my porch, "can I help you with something?" Her head snapped up. "Routine check," she said curtly, before scribbling something and marching away. That's when the paranoia set in. I found myself double-checking the blinds at night, parking my car exactly parallel, tires squared like a suspect awaiting judgment. Even grilling felt risky. The sizzle of ribs a guilty pleasure, every puff of smoke a potential citation. She had turned my home into a stage for her power play. And then came the midnight note. It was a Tuesday. Quiet. Too quiet. I just shut off the TV when I heard the faint crunch of footsteps outside. At first I thought it was a raccoon, maybe a stray cat, but something told me otherwise. I crept to the window, pulled the curtain back just enough, and saw the glow of a flashlight beam skittering across my lawn. I snapped on the porch light, and there she was, Karen, clipboard in hand, frozen like a burglar caught red-handed. She squinted, smiled nervously, then bolted toward the sidewalk. In her haste, she dropped something. By the time I reached the door, she was gone, swallowed by the cul-de-sac shadows. But on the welcome mat lay a folded slip of paper. I picked it up, unfolded it. My hands trembled. It wasn't typed like the official notices. This was handwritten, a scrawl that felt rushed, almost desperate. It read, "Further violations will result in escalated measures. Compliance is expected." No signature, no letterhead, just Karen's sharp, unmistakable handwriting. You tell me, does that sound like due process or intimidation? The next morning, I brought it up to the board. The meeting was held in the clubhouse, the kind of beige, fluorescent-lit room designed to strip conversations of humanity. Folding chairs lined the carpet. Karen presided at the head of the table like a queen overseeing peasants. "Can you explain this?" I asked, sliding the note across the table. She glanced at it once, then smiled. "I have no knowledge of this. Perhaps a neighbor left it. We take anonymous complaints very seriously." Anonymous. That word again. It was her shield, her favorite disguise. She'd built an entire empire of control behind the mask of community standards. "Funny," I said. "The handwriting looks familiar." Her eyes narrowed. Accusations without proof can themselves be considered harassment. The board members shifted uncomfortably. Nobody wanted to touch the fire. And that was her brilliance. She knew exactly how far she could push without crossing the bright red line of legality. She lived in the gray zones, in the vague wording of bylaws and the cowardice of committees. Each inspection, each anonymous note, each random audit chipped away at my sanity while keeping her untouchable on paper. But paranoia has a flip side. It sharpens you. I started documenting everything. Dates, times, photos, copies of letters stacked in a manila folder like case evidence. She thought she was building a record against me. In reality, I was building one against her. Still, the tension escalated. Neighbors began avoiding eye contact. Conversations on the sidewalk broke off when I approached. And that night, I'd find myself staring at that porch light, remembering her frozen there like a raccoon, wondering if she'd be back. You ever feel hunted in your own home? That's where I was. And yet, in the midst of that dread, a realization bloomed. Karen wasn't just after me for fun. She was setting a precedent. She wanted the neighborhood to see me as the example, the cautionary tale. If she could break me, she could rule without resistance. But here's the thing about examples. Sometimes they backfire. I wasn't about to play defense forever, and as I closed my blinds that night, the manila folder thick on my desk, a thought gnawed at me. If Karen was willing to prowl my property at midnight, clipboard in hand, what else was she willing to do in the shadows?
The first whiff of mesquite drifted through the cul-de-sac, and with it came the neighbors. One by one, they shuffled into my yard carrying paper plates, soda cans, and the kind of nervous energy you feel when you're not sure if you're attending a party or a crime scene. Across the street, Karen stood rigid on her porch, clutching her phone like it was a weapon, her lips pressed so tight they looked bloodless. The sight of her glaring at us, rule book in one hand, iPhone in the other, was almost enough to make me laugh. Almost. What she didn't realize was that the smoke curling above my grill wasn't just from chicken wings and ribs. It was a signal, a message, and it was spreading faster than she could control. You ever notice how rebellion never starts with speeches or manifestos? It starts with the little things, a shared meal, a knowing glance, a joke whispered just loud enough to carry. That's what this was. A neighborhood starving for more than food, starving for relief from Karen's chokehold. But let me back up 3 weeks because this plan didn't form overnight. It started after the midnight note, the one I told you about before. I spent a few restless nights staring at the ceiling, the words, "Compliance is expected," echoing in my head like a threat scratched into concrete. And then, one Friday afternoon, while scrubbing my grill grates, I realized something. Karen might control the paperwork, but I controlled the air, the smells, the atmosphere of the block. She had bylaws, but I had smoke. That night, I rolled the grill to the front yard. I cracked open a pack of ribs, seasoned them heavy, and let the hiss of the coals echo like a challenge. The first to wander over was Mike from 2 doors down. He stood there awkwardly, hands in pockets, sniffing the air. "Smells good," he said. I grinned. "Grab a plate, plenty to go around." Within minutes, word spread. The Johnson kids darted over with paper towels. Rachel, from the corner, brought a jug of lemonade. Even old Mrs. Whitfield, who usually peeked from behind curtains, shuffled over with a folding chair. By sundown, a dozen neighbors were in my yard, laughing, eating, and for the first time in months, forgetting about violation letters. Across the street, Karen stood in her driveway, arms folded, watching, calculating. She didn't say a word that first night, but I could feel her fury from here, like static in the air. The next morning, a notice arrived. Unapproved gathering on residential lot. She claimed the HOA required prior approval for organized neighborhood events. Technically true in some communities, but in ours, the bylaws only applied to events in the shared spaces, the clubhouse, the pool. My yard wasn't on that list. I circled the clause in the rule book and taped her notice to my fridge like a trophy. And then, the following Saturday, I fired up the grill again. This time, I leaned into it. Flyers, hand-drawn, nothing official, tucked into mailboxes. Saturday smokeout, free food, bring what you want. Nothing fancy, just enough to signal that this wasn't a one-off, this was the start of something. And the neighbors showed, twice as many as before. People brought potato salad, cornbread, coolers of soda. Even someone dragged out a Bluetooth speaker, filling the air with classic rock while smoke curled over the rooftops. The smell of ribs and brisket mixed with laughter, clinking cups, and for the first time, unity. You should have seen Karen. She paced the edge of her property like a border guard, phone pressed to her ear. I could almost hear her words. "Yes, officer, there's a gathering. Yes, they're grilling." But no police ever came. Why? Because nothing we were doing broke municipal law. There was no noise violation, no curfew breach, no ordinance against feeding your neighbors. Karen's power lived in fear, not facts. Of course, she didn't give up. Monday morning, another letter. This one claimed excessive smoke emissions were a nuisance under the Quiet Enjoyment Clause.
That's HOA language for anything they can't actually regulate but want to scare you with. But the city's ordinances told a different story. As long as the smoke wasn't continuous or hazardous, backyard cooking was perfectly legal. I printed that section of the municipal code and slipped it under her door, a little counterpunch. By the third weekend, it wasn't just rebellion, it was ritual. Families circled dates on calendars. Kids begged their parents to go. Even the more timid neighbors, the ones who used to scurry past Karen with nods and forced smiles, now lingered in my yard, chatting long after the plates were empty. I remember one conversation in particular. Rachel leaned in, eyes darting toward Karen's house. "You know, people are starting to talk," she whispered. "About what?" I asked, feigning innocence. "That Karen doesn't run this place as much as she thinks, that maybe she's vulnerable." The word hung there like smoke. Vulnerable. That was the moment I knew the tide was shifting. Because rebellion isn't just about what you do, it's about what people believe, and belief spreads faster than any notice she could mail. But of course, rebellion attracts retaliation, and Karen made her move the fourth Saturday. It started with a confrontation. She crossed the street, clipboard in hand, the weapon she always carried. The party hushed as she marched into my yard, her heels clicking like gavels. "This," she announced, waving her clipboard at the crowd, "is an unauthorized event in violation of HOA guidelines. You are all participants in a non-compliant gathering." The laughter and chatter died instantly. Neighbors exchanged nervous glances. Plates froze in midair. For a second, it felt like she'd won, that she'd shattered the illusion of safety. I stepped forward, wiping my hands on a towel. "Karen," I said calmly, "the HOA bylaws apply to common spaces. This is private property, and unless you're here for a burger, I suggest you step back." Gasps rippled through the crowd. It was the first time anyone had said it out loud. Karen's face flushed crimson. She sputtered something about excessive fines and further consequences, but her voice cracked, and the authority she clung to sounded suddenly fragile. Then something remarkable happened. Mike, quiet, unassuming Mike, spoke up. "Karen, we're just having dinner. Nobody's hurting anyone. Maybe you should join in instead of policing everything." A murmur of agreement rolled through the yard. Heads nodded. Karen's eyes darted, searching for support, but found none. For the first time, she looked small, alone. She turned on her heel and stormed back across the street, slamming her door hard enough to rattle windows. The party erupted again. Laughter returned louder this time, almost defiant. And as the smoke from the grill rose into the twilight sky, I realized we had crossed the line. Karen's grip was weakening, and everyone had seen it. But here's the thing about power. When it slips, people don't let it go quietly. They claw, they scheme, they double down. That night, as I scraped the grill and packed away the folding chairs, I noticed something taped to my mailbox. Another note. Not typed this time, handwritten. "This isn't over. You've made a mistake." I held it under the porch light, the ink smudged, but the intent clear as crystal. And I couldn't help but smile. Because the smoke signals had done their job. The neighbors weren't just eating ribs anymore. They were starting to believe. And belief is the one thing Karen could never regulate, no matter how many bylaws she twisted. Still, as I slipped the note into my growing folder of evidence, one question burned hotter than the coals beneath my grill. If this was her warning shot, what was Karen planning next?
"You can't do this. This is a violation of... Karen's voice cracked, echoing through the community hall, as two waiters in crisp black vests rolled in a steel cart stacked with trays of brisket and ribs. The smell hit like a tidal wave, rich smoke and sweet barbecue sauce sweeping across the room. Neighbors gasped, then chuckled. Some clapped. Others fumbled for napkins as if they'd been ambushed by hunger itself. And there was Karen, frozen behind the HOA podium, her gavel dangling uselessly in one hand. Picture it, the HOA president screaming into a microphone while a catering crew passed out pulled pork sandwiches on HOA turf.
That was the moment the war broke wide open. But let me rewind, because you need to understand how carefully I set this trap. 3 weeks earlier, Karen had escalated her campaign against me. The barbecue nights in my yard had turned the tide of neighbor loyalty, and she knew it. People were talking about challenging her position in the next election, whispers of replacing her with someone less tyrannical. But Karen wasn't one to go quietly. She started sending notices faster than junk mail, trash cans left out too long, lawn not trimmed to uniform height, and even a violation for a garden hose visible from the street. One morning I received a certified letter. It cited me for repeated nuisances and summoned me to a disciplinary hearing at the next HOA board meeting. That's when it clicked. She wanted a stage. She wanted me humiliated in front of the whole neighborhood. So I decided to give her a stage, all right, but one she couldn't control. You see, HOA bylaws, like most community governance documents, are full of loopholes if you know where to look, and I had started studying them like scripture. Section 8.4 of ours stated, residents may request to utilize common facilities for events, provided appropriate forms are submitted at least 14 days prior and fees are remitted. Nowhere did it say events had to be approved by the president. The board could object, sure, but if the paperwork was clean, denial wasn't automatic. So I did what any cunning neighbor with a smoker obsession would do. I filed the paperwork to rent the community hall for Resident Appreciation Dinner. Not under my name, though, under my LLC. That little catering side hustle I registered a year ago, perfect cover. I even paid the $75 fee with a company check, so it looked official. Karen would have had to stage a full board vote to block it, and by the time she realized what I'd done, the clock had run out. Now, here's where it gets fun. The same night Karen scheduled my disciplinary hearing, oh yes, the one where she planned to shame me publicly, was the night my paperwork booked the hall, which meant legally, contractually, the space was reserved for my event. And nothing in the bylaws prohibited catering food at an HOA meeting. Nothing. I hired a local barbecue joint with stainless steel chafing dishes, real pit-smoked brisket, and mac and cheese that could make a grown man weep. They didn't ask questions when I told them it was for a neighborhood dinner. Paid them in advance, tip included. Fast forward to the night of the meeting. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, folding chairs squeaked as neighbors shuffled in. The mood was tense. Karen had stacked the agenda with dry items, landscaping contracts, pool hours, before my so-called hearing. She thought boredom would soften everyone up for her grand performance. I sat in the second row, arms folded, calm as a judge. Behind me, murmurs rippled, folks wondering what this dinner thing was about, some confused by the flyers I'd slipped into mailboxes earlier that week. Free food after the meeting, all welcome. I watched Karen scan the crowd, her smile tight as dental floss. Then, 15 minutes in, right as she cleared her throat to announce my disciplinary item, the doors swung open. In came the catering crew, wheeling carts stacked with foiled trays. The smell hit instantly. Smoky, sweet, rich, brisket, ribs, pulled pork, baked beans, cornbread. It was sensory overload in the middle of a sterile HOA meeting. Heads turned, eyes widened, stomachs growled audibly. Karen froze. "Excuse me? This is a private board meeting." The lead server checked his clipboard. We have a reservation for a resident appreciation dinner booked under Smokehouse Catering, LLC. This is the community hall, correct?" Gasps and chuckles rolled through the crowd. I raised my hand. "That's us, right here." The board members shifted uncomfortably. One, Mr. Patel, muttered, well, it is properly filed. I saw the paperwork." Another nodded. Fee was paid. Karen slammed the gavel. "This is outrageous. We cannot have—" Her voice cracked under the laughter breaking out in the crowd. Neighbors began lining up at the buffet without waiting for permission. Plates clattered, kids cheered, the servers handed out napkins with professional ease, oblivious to Karen's meltdown.
"You're undermining the authority of this board," she shrieked. I leaned back in my chair, plate already stacked with brisket, and said loud enough for half the room to hear, "No, Karen, I'm feeding the people who pay your dues." That line landed like a firecracker. The room erupted in applause, whistles, even a few stomps on the floor. Karen's face flushed crimson. She pounded the gavel again, but the sound was drowned out by laughter and the scrape of serving tongs. And here's the thing. In HOA law, perception is power. The board might hold the bylaws, but neighbors hold the votes. And in that moment, Karen's image, the all-powerful president who ruled with mailed notices and fear, crumbled. All anyone saw was a woman red-faced and sputtering while her constituents feasted on free barbecue. She tried to recover. "This food is not sanctioned. You cannot bribe residents with—" "Bribe?" someone interrupted. It was Rachel, standing with a plate of ribs in hand. "Karen, it's dinner. Maybe you should sit down and have some before you pop a blood vessel." The laughter hit harder this time, rolling through the hall like thunder. Even the board members smirked. Her own allies avoided her eyes. For a split second, I almost thought she might actually walk out. But no, Karen wasn't built to retreat. Instead, she doubled down. She launched into a tirade about precedent and liability and setting a dangerous example. She rattled off section numbers so fast she sounded like an auctioneer, but no one was listening. They were eating, talking, smiling. Her words evaporated against the clatter of forks and the sound of neighbors actually enjoying themselves for once. I'll admit, I felt a surge of smug satisfaction. Months of intimidation, fines, midnight notes, and now she was powerless, drowned out by the scent of smoked meat. But under that satisfaction, a deeper realization simmered. This wasn't just about me. It was about everyone she'd bullied with citations for cracked driveways or kids' bikes left on lawns. Tonight wasn't rebellion anymore. It was proof Karen could bleed. Of course, Karen knew it too. You could see it in her eyes, the way they darted, calculating. She wasn't beaten yet. No, she'd be already scheming, already spinning this humiliation into justification for harsher rules. Because people like Karen never stop at defeat. They claw until there's nothing left. The meeting limped on, technically. Karen tried to resume the agenda, but each motion was drowned by laughter, conversations, and the occasional "pass me the mac and cheese." When she finally called for adjournment, her voice was hoarse, brittle. No gavel strike could disguise the fact that she'd lost control of her stage. As the crowd dispersed, I lingered. One of the servers thanked me, whispered, "Best gig we've had in months." I slipped him a tip and turned back towards the hall. Karen was still there, stacking papers with trembling hands, refusing to meet my eyes. For a moment, I almost pitied her. Almost. Then I remembered the fines, the intimidation, the trespassing in the middle of the night. No, pity wasn't on the menu. Still, as I walked out into the cool night air, something gnawed at me. That meltdown hadn't been her end. It was her awakening. If humiliation burns, imagine what it does to someone addicted to power. And Karen? She was about to burn hotter than any smoker I could fire up. So I ask you, listener, what happens when the queen of the cul-de-sac realizes her crown has slipped? Because if you thought the meltdown was the climax, you haven't seen what comes next.
Her heels struck the linoleum like gunshots, each stomp ricocheting through the meeting hall as she bolted for the exit. Karen's face was blotchy red, eyes glassy with rage, her lips pressed into a trembling line. Behind her, the soundscape was a different universe. Neighbors laughing, forks clinking against paper plates, the unmistakable sizzle of pulled pork being spooned out for seconds. She stormed out, but the party didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder, hungrier, freer. And for the first time since this war began, I felt the tide turning for good. The room had transformed into a battlefield masquerading as a buffet. Smoke and sauce carried on every laugh, weaving through the hall like a victory banner. You might think that's hyperbole, but when you've lived under the thumb of someone like Karen, someone who weaponizes bylaws like bullets, every bite of brisket felt like reclaiming stolen ground. I sat there, watching her storm off, and a question settled into my bones. Was this the beginning of her downfall, or the calm before her most desperate strike? That night wasn't just a neighborhood potluck. It was proof that the lines had shifted, that her grip on power wasn't unbreakable. But let me rewind, because what happened next didn't just unfold, it detonated. 2 days after the infamous barbecue meeting, the board held an emergency session. Now, if you've never dealt with HOA politics, here's something you need to know. Emergency meetings don't happen unless the board believes the stability of the association is at risk. The notice was slid into our mailboxes at dawn, the kind of cheap paper that smells faintly of toner. I remember holding it up under the kitchen light, the words agenda, leadership concerns, stamped like a warrant. By that evening, the room was different. The folding tables were lined up in a narrow rectangle, the board members shoulder to shoulder, faces tight. Karen was there too, of course, perched at the head like a general cornered by her own soldiers. "Order!" she snapped, banging the gavel with more force than necessary. But no one really listened. You could feel it. Her authority had started to leak away like air from a punctured tire. The treasurer, Mr. Alvarez, cleared his throat first. "Karen, with all due respect, the catering incident was an embarrassment. Residents are questioning whether this board represents them or your personal grievances." Her neck stiffened, the kind of stiff where you know someone's about to break. "Personal grievances," she spat. "I was enforcing the bylaws. Section 8.2, subsection D, states that commercial use of common areas requires pre-approval, and the paperwork was filed properly. We checked." Alvarez cut in. The silence after that was volcanic. She hadn't expected the board to verify. She hadn't expected anyone to stand up to her. And for once, her favorite weapon, the bylaws themselves, had been turned against her. I sat in the back row, arms crossed, watching her flail. The neighbors around me whispered, some smiling, some shaking their heads in disbelief. You could feel it in the air. Karen was losing the room. But let's not get carried away. People like her don't crumble in a single night. They dig in, lash out harder, look for new angles. And true to form, she tried. The following week, envelopes arrived. Not warnings this time, but violation notices. Not just for me, but for nearly half the block. Trash cans left out too long, grass measured an inch too high, cars parked facing the wrong direction. She'd blanketed the neighborhood in fines, each one stamped with her meticulous signature. It was her counterattack, her attempt to remind us all who held the pen. Now here's the twist. Those letters backfired spectacularly, because when you find half your residents in one sweep, you don't come across as a diligent enforcer. You look desperate. You look petty. And that's exactly how the board saw it. 3 weeks later, another meeting was called. This time, the turnout was the largest I'd ever seen. Folding chairs filled every corner, neighbors standing against the walls. You could feel it in the air, that metallic taste you get before a thunderstorm breaks. I remember the way Mrs. Henderson, the secretary, shuffled papers with trembling hands. The agenda was simple: whether or not Karen should remain president. It wasn't technically a vote of removal. Bylaws required a more formal petition process for that. But it was the first time anyone had dared to put her leadership under scrutiny. She knew it. You could see it in her eyes, darting like a trapped animal. And then she did something no one expected. She tried to turn the crowd against me. "This entire spectacle," she hissed, voice sharp enough to cut glass, "was orchestrated by him." She pointed directly at me, fingers shaking. "He's been undermining the rules, mocking this board, poisoning our community with his cookouts and spectacles. He thinks he's clever, but he's dangerous." I'll admit it, my stomach knotted. For a second, all eyes swung to me, and I felt the weight of it. But then a voice cut through the silence. Dangerous? It was Mr. Patel,
a quiet neighbor who rarely spoke. He stood, arms folded, and said what half the room had been thinking. Dangerous is threatening fines over grill smoke. Dangerous is sneaking on the people's property at night with a clipboard. We're tired of it, Karen. Applause erupted. Actual applause right there in the meeting hall. Karen's face darkened, her lips pulled tight, but she couldn't drown out the sound. The tide had turned, and she couldn't stop it. Still, it wasn't the final blow. Not yet. The bylaws required a formal recall petition, signatures from at least 51% of homeowners. And while plenty of neighbors were angry enough to sign, Karen wasn't going down without dragging the fight into the mud. She threatened litigation, hinted at outside counsel, and whispered about selective enforcement claims that could tie the association in court for months. This wasn't just HOA theater anymore. It was legal brinksmanship, and I had to be careful. So I pivoted. Instead of pushing for her removal directly, I pushed for something quieter but more permanent. An amendment to the architectural guidelines, specifically to explicitly allow outdoor smokers, provided they were maintained in safe condition and used within reasonable hours. It was the kind of amendment that required a community vote, not board approval, which meant Karen couldn't block it. I spent weeks canvassing the neighborhood, knocking on doors with the smell of hickory smoke still clinging to my jacket. Every conversation followed the same rhythm. People tired of arbitrary fines, tired of Karen's surveillance, tired of living under a microscope. By the time the vote came, the outcome wasn't even close. The amendment passed with overwhelming support. My smoker, the very symbol of her crusade, was now officially sanctioned. And that's when Karen finally snapped. The night after the vote, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my window. Not the clumsy shuffle of a raccoon, not the rhythmic patter of sprinklers. Human steps. Slow, deliberate. I flicked on the porch light, and for a split second, there she was, clipboard in hand, frozen like a thief caught in mid-act. Our eyes locked, and then she bolted, darting across the street into the shadows. I tell you this not because it was surprising, but because it wasn't. That was who she was, unable to let go, unwilling to concede, desperate enough to haunt the sidewalks at midnight just to feel in control. And yet, as strange as it sounds, I didn't feel triumphant in that moment. I felt something colder, sharper, the sense that the war wasn't over, that she had one last card hidden up her sleeve. Because people like her don't just vanish when you beat them at their own game. They regroup, they fester, they wait for the perfect moment to strike back. So when I lit the smoker the next morning, smoke curling into the pale dawn sky, I wasn't just celebrating victory. I was sending a signal to my neighbors, to the board, to Karen herself. The smell drifted down the block, sweet and defiant, while her window stayed shuttered, her house dark as stone. But let me ask you this. What happens when someone like her, cornered and humiliated, decides they've got nothing left to lose? Because that, my friend, was the question that kept me awake long after the fire died down.